Hello everyone and welcome back to another book review. Today I am going to be reviewing an audiobook that I listened to. It is Great Minds of the Medieval World, and this is one of the great courses that have been created. I'm not really sure, I haven't really taken any by them before, but they seem to be like audio lectures. There may have been a physical or a video component, but I didn't happen to see that. I just listened to the audio component and it listened sort of like an audiobook. This was my first time doing one of the great courses and I was impressed. I really liked it and I thought this was a fantastic introduction to some of the thinkers of the medieval world. So in today's video, I'm going to briefly touch on what was covered in the great courses so you can decide if this is something that you want to listen to. I want to start off by saying that we are going to move very quickly, and the course itself moves very quickly through the great thinkers. And these people, each individually, probably could have had their own 12-hour audiobook just about each one of these alone. So the fact that I'm going to cover and reduce each of these thinkers to one or two brief sentences that were kind of my key takeaways from the lecture is not supposed to be indicative of, in any capacity, of how much these individuals actually contributed to the medieval world. So if this feels like I'm being very reductive or it's very simplistic, I think that was just due to the nature. It is a 12-hour audiobook, but they're covering a large number of thinkers and they're trying to hit all the highlights of this medieval period, which we can roughly bound by 500 to 1500 AD. So overall, we're covering a lot of ground and we're gonna have to move very fast by necessity. And the people that were selected, I'm not sure how they selected it, but I think it was a really good selection. I have to say, if I ever won the lottery, I think the number one thing I would do, I wouldn't buy a fancy house, I wouldn't buy a fancy boat, I wouldn't buy a fancy car. I would want to just quit my job and spend a whole year reading through the texts that these people have written, because I think that would just be so fascinating to kind of get I don't know if it's necessarily the Western canon because there are some Arab thinkers in here as well, but some of the key writers who really influenced the modern world and where a lot of discoveries and progress was made from. Just reading through that would be fascinating, but these people I'm sure have written very complex texts that take a lot to work through. So I think I would need a couple years and a substantial amount of money to sit on and no day job to work through them. So with that being said, I'm going to go through these, and I have my notes on my laptop down here, so we're just going to have to work through my notes and give a brief update and kind of talk about all the thinkers that were covered in this great course. We start off with Augustine of Hippo, or is it Augustine? I've heard both. And he is a natural starting point. He is a giant of the Christian faith, and the Christian faith and the Catholic Church were absolute powerhouses in the Middle Ages. I really think in the Christian faith, he kind of falls in terms of like being well known and influential, probably like behind Jesus and Paul maybe. So he's very, very influential writings. He wrote, I believe, City of God, but he also wrote Confessions, which is very, very famous, deeply influential. And he is referenced again and again throughout the later thinkers as being someone that they've referred back to. So he is a natural starting point and we start there. And this is what I mean by this is the highlight reel of the highlight reel, because we are already moving on, and Augustine or Augustine, however we say him, could probably have a whole 12-hour audiobook on his own. The second group of thinkers that are covered are Ambrose, Jerome, and Gregory the Great, who kind of exist in a circle influencing each other, and they are all in turn influenced by Augustine or Augustine. Ambrose introduced a symbolic reading of the scripture, which was something that didn't really exist up to that point. Jerome was actually responsible for translating a Latin version of the Gospel and Old Testament into what's now called the Vulgate, and the Vulgate is very, very influential in the medieval world in the future. Well, the future from Jerome's perspective. So the Vulgate is very, very influential, and he was responsible for that. And Gregory the Great was more responsible for his implementation and support of ideas. Gregory the Great was a pope, and there were a lot of popes, but he's one that maybe you should know more about. One of his more influential things was sending St. Augustine, a different one I think, or Augustine, however we say it, to England to convert the Anglo-Saxons. But he emphasized monastic living and also emphasized the importance of the city of Rome, and that becomes very influential throughout the rest of the Middle Ages. So Ambrose, Jerome, Gregory the Great are lumped together. Next is Boethius. Boethius is notable because he translated a lot of books into Latin, which would be what was preserved during the medieval world. And a lot of what we know about history is based on what survived and what was translated. And this is something we see later with Bede. So his translations are quite important. He also had influence on the quadrivium, which was the four-way path, which was believed to be very essential in medieval education. That's arithmetic, geometry, music, and astronomy. So that's something we come across again and again in medieval education theory. And he was kind of responsible for it. Isidore of Sevilla, he wrote the Etymologies, which is one of the key works that comes up again and again throughout the Middle Ages. And he also thought that priests and monks should be appropriately educated. That was important to him. So yeah, that comes up. Again, as you can see, we are moving through some of these absolutely influential thinkers, and I feel like I'm not doing them justice. And this is, the audiobook takes a little bit more time. I would say about half an hour per thinker, but that really is only enough to scratch the surface. And I'll get into that when I do my review. Venerable Bede, this was an English monk from Northumbria. He was influenced by Isidore and indirectly by Gregory the Great, because Gregory the Great would have led the conversion mission, which influenced how he existed. He was part of what we call the Northumbrian Renaissance, and he wrote an ecclesiastical history of the English people, which is very, very important. It's important because this ties in with what I was saying about Boethius. What we know about history is what survives. And Bede compiled his history from sources that are now lost to us. So kind of his writing is what survives in a lot of these cases. We do not know, or we don't have copies of these sources that he used. And it was only because Bede wrote this that we have a window into some of these aspects of history that otherwise we could only recreate from things like archaeology, which give us maybe less of a complete picture than a written record. A written record is very, very important. So Bede, very, very influential. Then we go into Charlemagne and Alfred the Great, and is it Alcuin? So there was this chain of events where Bede influences Alcuin, who influences Charlemagne, who influences Alfred the Great. And this is kind of like in the very beginning where Augustine influences Jerome and Ambrose and Gregory the Great. So we have some more influence here, starting with Bede. Some things that came out of this chain of events of great thinkers were things like the Carolingian minuscule. Charlemagne really promoted literacy and writing, even though it was something he struggled with. He didn't learn to read until much later, and he always struggled with that. And around this time too, Vikings began raiding and destroying monasteries. Alfred the Great had some influence on in that regard, but the Vikings never really fully go away for a while from this time. Avicenna comes up, so this is where we start getting into non-Christian thinkers. So he's an Arab thinker. He wrote the Book of Healing and the Canon of Medicine, two influential works. He is associated with the Golden Age of Islam, which is something that's covered in this great course. Again, the highlight reel of the highlight reel. Then we go to Al-Hasan. I hope I'm saying that name correctly, another Arab thinker. He was responsible, or a Muslim thinker. I don't remember if all these were necessarily Arab thinkers, but he wrote a book on optics, and he also was one to make the link between algebra and geometry, which was a critical link for analytical geometry, and it paved the way for non-Euclidean geometry, which would not happen until the 1800s. I think something that we can see over and over throughout these books, or these thinkers, is some of their ideas didn't come to fruition for 500, 600, 700 more years. It really takes a long time for some of these ideas to like percolate and come to their full form. And the seeds, though, were planted so far in the past. Averroes is the next one. So this chapter, or this section on Averroes, did an introduction to Islam and the role that it played. So that's where we kind of got an introduction in the great course to that major world religion. But he wrote some commentaries on Aristotle, which were very influential. And he is a vital link from the ancient world to the medieval world. So his writings became the link. And I know sometimes we talk about the Golden Age of Islam being something that preserved a lot of ancient writings. And he is a key person who's kind of associated with that. Then we go to a Jewish thinker called Maimonides. He was very influential in legal and philosophical thought, and he also influenced the Via Negativa. If I remember correctly, this isn't in my notes, but remembering from the audiobook, He wrote a commentary on Jewish texts, which is considered the commentary. And there's this idea that there's no need for any further commentary on the religious texts. There's only need for further commentary on Maimonides. I believe that was like the feature of that. He was so thorough and did such a good job. And he is also included in some statues in the US Capitol, I believe they mentioned, because of his thought process for legal thought. Rashi, born into a hostile society. So he was another Jewish, oh, sorry, I'm confusing him with Rashi. Okay, so Maimonides did the legal and the philosophical thought. Rashi was the one who wrote his commentary, and after his commentary, no further commentary was needed, just commentary on his commentary. So there was two Jewish thinkers. I apologize, I got those mixed up. But there was a discussion at this time how sometimes, even though these thinkers would be from different religions, they would find a lot of common ground in their works. Next, Saladin. A very respected leader from the Muslim world. He comes up during the Crusades. I actually wrote a paper of him and how he appeared in Dante's Inferno in my college humanities course. I went to a liberal arts school, so even though my degree's in math, I was required to take 2 semesters of humanities, and I really consider that important. Next, Hildegard of Bingen. It's important to note this is the first woman who appears, and I think only one of 2, so not a lot of women. They were kind of locked out of education and aspects outside homemaking. So yeah, they weren't always able to maybe reach their full potential. She, however, was an abbess and was able to, when listening to her story, able to negotiate the political world quite well. And she was able to secure necessary permissions. And just the way she moved, you could tell she had an understanding of the political world, which served her very, very well. She is recognized as a saint, but something that is notable is she was very closely associated with our next thinker, Bernard of Clairvaux, and Bernard of Clairvaux was canonized very, very soon after his death, relatively. Well, Hildegard of Bingen had to wait many hundreds of years, but she is, excuse me, she's recognized for her theological teachings, and that's something that not a lot of people are recognized for in the Catholic Church, so it's even more impressive that a medieval woman would be recognized for her theological teachings. She saw visions and was able to kind of politically navigate that to avoid getting in trouble for her visions, so very interesting. Bernard of Clairvaux is another thinker who worked with Hildegard of Bingen, contemporary of Hildegard, but canonized much sooner because he was a man, probably, let's be honest. But those two are linked. Next is Peter Abelard and Eloise. This is a student-teacher duo who became lovers. I've actually heard this story before. Things did not end well, I don't think necessarily for them, but it's clear that they worked together and bounced ideas off each other, among other things. So, yeah, an interesting duo. I had heard their story before, and another woman who was able to kind of make a name for herself in the medieval world. Then we have Thomas Aquinas, whose work, the Summa Theologica, I hope I'm saying that right, is a very, very big influence in the medieval world and to today. He tackled things like the two-truth problem, and his career is emblematic of reform in monasticism. Those are my notes on Thomas Aquinas. I feel like for some of these thinkers, we just are scratching the surface. But there's a brief biography, and his Summa Theologica is considered very important. Next up are 2 thinkers, William of Ockham and John Duns Scotus. I had heard of Ockham, but I had not heard of Duns Scotus. But many of us have heard of Occam's razor, which says the simplest solution is usually the correct solution. And the lecture in the course makes it very clear that that's not actually, that's maybe a little twist on Occam, what Occam actually meant in his writings. He was very focused on the reasoning and that you can't reason from a hypothetical argument. But Occam was influenced by Duns Scotus, so that's the link between those 2 thinkers. Then we have Geoffrey Chaucer and Dante Alighieri. These are heavyweights in the literature canon, I guess you could say. I have read both of them. I've read Chaucer and I read Dante. Again, both in that humanities class that I took. So I liked I liked both of them. I liked Chaucer and I liked Dante. I only read Inferno by Dante, but I did like both of them. They were both notable for writing in their vernacular and both influenced their respective languages. So that's interesting. Dante actually placed a pope in hell in one of his books. I remember that from my college course, which got him in some trouble. His books were banned. He wasn't necessarily liked by the establishment. He was placing people in Inferno left and right. So that was pretty funny. He had some problems with, I believe it was Pope Boniface, who was in the 8th circle of hell, which was pretty close to the 9th circle. I think 9th circle, that's like the worst sinners. I think the label for 9th circle is like traitors to benefactors, so like Judas, Brutus, and Cassius, I think, are in the 9th circle. The people who murdered Caesar or assassinated Caesar, and Judas, who betrayed Jesus. So 8th circle's pretty bad, and the Pope was in it, and the Pope didn't like it. And as the author mentions, almost everyone studies Chaucer at some point. I also had the chance to study Dante because of the college that I went to, and I think most people who have an interest in history would like to study both at some point. Then we have Petrarch. Petrarch really marks the beginning of this Renaissance, this period of something new. He's sometimes considered one of the fathers of humanism, which is the belief of the focus on the individual versus the group. There is sometimes maybe too much emphasis placed on the collective during the medieval period, but there is definitely an increase in the focus of the individual during this humanist period. And well, he's considered kind of the beginning and marks something of a Renaissance. It's hard to put an exact date to these things. Again, we're using Middle Ages 500 to 1500, but that's kind of a wishy-washy date. So something to keep in mind, that just because we say he maybe marks the beginning of something new, doesn't mean he is the defining moment. He didn't wake up one day, decide to write something influential, and then everyone in the world immediately recognized, well, one period of time's over and we're moving into something new. That's not how it happens. Then we have Lorenzo de' Medici. So he's very much associated with the Renaissance, which the author takes a good moment here to discuss the Renaissance, where she says that some medieval scholars don't like the term because it tends to imply that the past 1,000 years have been very stagnant. And as we can tell by all the thinkers we've already been through, that's not the case at all. It was not a stagnant period of time. So it's maybe not the best word to use if we associate the previous period with being stagnant and the Renaissance and then people woke up and did something. And I think the great courses do a better job. I read this book called The Graphic Guide to the Middle Ages, which I overall liked, but the period where the author just kind of dismisses the Renaissance as nothing, or doesn't back up why the Renaissance isn't necessarily a great term, or how it can imply stagnancy. Is that a word? I think the author didn't do a good job in that book, so I like this great courses version a lot better. He was a statesman. He supported the arts, supported continuing education. So Lorenzo de' Medici and the Medici family comes up again and again in history. So we'll see them again. Then we have Christine de Pizan, who, another woman, one of the few women on the lists. Something that is spoken about at this time is the Black Death. And the Black Death killed a lot of people, but if you survive the Black Death, you may have had better opportunities following the Black Death. This is where we start seeing the lower classes getting maybe some more opportunities. They can negotiate better. And there were some attempts, I know, to like artificially keep wages down. But ultimately, the Black Death was a massive, massive turning point. I would love to read a book all on just the Black Death. I actually have a book. The Black Death and the Transformation of the West. My dad got me this book, so maybe I should read that. Maybe I should. Women actually were one of the groups that came out better from the Black Death, and Christine de Pizan is the example given in this course, and she is a writer. She's, again, one of the few women on the list. And then we go into our last two thinkers, Thomas Malory. He is one who wrote the Arthurian legend, which had existed. It existed in many forms throughout the Middle Ages, but he kind of canonized it, and he sorted through all the literature to create one narrative, which was very, very important. He had this retelling and expansion, and the Arthurian legend is something that we consider quintessentially medieval, I think. So, yeah. At this point, we see a looking back at the medieval period as something distinct, so it's very clear that something has passed, and Thomas Malory is trying to recapture that. And finally, we discussed William Caxton. He was the individual who influenced printing in Europe. So printing is a turning point in history, a massive, massive turning point. The printed press had existed in China for a while, but coming to Europe through Johannes Gutenberg and now William Caxton in English is a big deal. And something that the author touched on that I think is important too in this section is how what gets printed is a decision that has to be made, like what texts are actually printed and then widely disseminated, and that what is printed influences how people think about things. So I think choosing what gets printed is a key decision, and William Caxton is one of those individuals who brought printing to Europe, and well, he brought it to England, I should say. It came to Europe, but he brought it to England, and his influence on the English language and what was printed in the English language was huge. So overall, I think this was actually a really good introduction to the Middle Ages and the great thinkers. I think it will give you enough to be familiar with the name when you hear it, and you can connect it to a few basic facts, which is probably the most important thing. Obviously, this is not enough to give you a solid introduction, and every one of these thinkers is going to be unique and have a lot that needs to be covered outside this great course, but I was actually highly impressed. I didn't find any need to have the visual component if there was one. I think it was well put together and well discussed. I think her name was Dorsey Armstrong, who narrated or lectured the course, did a really good job and kept it entertaining. And it did take me like 3 weeks to get through this, but the sections on the thinkers are in little, almost like half-hour segments. So you can just listen to a couple segments at a time and get what you need to learn. Easy and plenty of places to pause and then pick back up. So if you're looking for a brief overview to the great minds of the medieval world, I would recommend checking out this great courses. I really liked it. I think it did a good job of introducing all these individuals, and I think if you're looking for an introduction, it could be good for you. If you have any thoughts or comments, if after hearing this review you would like to suggest a book, please leave that in the comment section down below. Thank you so much for watching, and I hope you have a great rest of your day.